I believe I'm live. Good morning, everybody. My name's John Ryan. I am in New Zealand, where it is tomorrow morning, and I am very privileged to be a presenter at this conference. And the topic of my presentation is VFPA and VFP C Compiler, a new lease of life for VFP. This is in fact an enormous topic. So what I'll try and do is, as much as I can, I will attempt to follow the white paper that I've also presented and try and give you a good feeling for both of these products and how you can use them to improve your Fox development and provide a credible path forwards. My own background is I'm a medical practitioner, where I was until 1992, when I stopped for 1 year, so I thought, to go and write some software for doctors. So I've been a Fox user since the Fox-based days. I was the first commercial user of VFP C Compiler, so I guess I'm here with 10 years of experience to show you how it was used. I'm now going to, if I can, spare you the sight of my face and attempt to concentrate on the other things I'd like to show you. So, whoops. What I would like to do is talk to you about the principles and the purposes of VFPA, which is a VFP add-on, the principles and purpose of VFP C Compiler, talk a little bit about x64 or 64-bit development, because yes, these products do provide a 64-bit path forwards. And then hopefully at the end there'll be some question time. In order to do that, if I can just briefly pop across to my white paper, I'll try and follow the rough structure in this white paper, not slavishly, but as closely as possible. So I'd like to talk about the purposes of VFPA and VFP Compiler, bugs and interoperability improvements, and increased functionality, installing the products, some of the bugs and features that have been improved or remedied, moving on towards x64-bit development, and then on into VFP C Compiler, and followed by question times at the end. So where possible, I'm going to try and follow that rough path. So we'll start with VFPA, and VFPA is a VFP9 add-on. And as I said earlier, its purpose, now I do believe I've still got my mug showing, so we'll turn that off. There we go. The purpose of VFPA is bug fixes, interoperability improvements, and enhancements. The enhancements include new functions and 64-bit development, and the price of VFPA is, in all currencies, it's the same, which is $0. And that very good news is an appropriate time to talk. Oh, I see what's happening. When I click space, it turns it back on. It's an appropriate time to introduce Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen, apologies for pronunciation, Chen Shuabing. He is a Chinese national and software developer who is single-handedly responsible for VFPA compiler and VFPA. He, like many of us here, is a long-time Fox developer, starting in 1990, so he's got a 30-year history. He began developing VFP C compiler in 2008, and he began developing VFPA Advanced in 2012. And my only role in this equation is that I'm a paying customer and a fan of Mr. Chen. This is probably a very appropriate time to say thank you. When you look at the history of VFP, Mr. Chen is joining a number of other luminaries who have voluntarily provided great functionality for our enjoyment. I can think of people like Rick Strahl, who over last century repaired a bug in FoxPro to help those of us who were early web developers. Then you've got people like Craig Boyd and his VFP FLLs for encryption and compression. And you've now got Mr. Chen with his VFPA, which fixes bugs and provides increased functionality for us. We're very lucky in the VFP community. I think that's one of the reasons why we're still able to use this product, is because we have this generosity from people like him. And of course, let's not forget the organizers of this conference. Entirely voluntary effort and a very impressive achievement by everybody. But moving along, if we look at VFPA, which we're about to do, the IDE is effectively identical to VFP9. The FLLs and other dependencies all work the same. The sweet potato FLLs work. WWIP stuff works. Common controls work. Even old FLLs like PHD base, they all work. So if we're going to install VFPA, here's how we do it. You download the installer from Mr. Chen's website, and the link for that is in the white paper. And it's got a setup which you can simply run. And a couple of things to notice. First of all, there's an absolute dependency to have VFP9 installed before you can install VFPA. There's good reason for that. VFPA actually harvests a lot of the files from VFP9 to use in your VFPA environment. And in this situation for testing, I've actually got my VFP9 installed under the program files folder. Many users actually stopped doing that because of interoperability problems, of UAC preventing use of functions, preventing things being written, and stuff like that. But one of the quiet interoperability improvements of VFP Advanced, or VFPA, is that you can start to consider putting it back into program files, because step by step and as we go along, the problems with UAC are being resolved in VFP Advanced so that you can once again install it as a properly behaving Windows citizen where it should go. Even those who've used the product before may not be aware of these two brand new features. And this is not actually a VFP specific thing, but I wonder if I can show you. I've got it here. All right. I was going to try and show you, there's a problem in Windows when you've got greater than 100% scaling in place. There are known VFP bugs in that situation, but there's also now problems in other applications as well. So that if you've got more than 100% scaling, you can start to see fuzzy toolbars, wrongly sized icons, and other visual artifacts creeping in. And I think that's a function of 4K monitors becoming more and more common in the Windows environment, and Microsoft attempting to keep compatibility and running into a few problems. And there's some ways around this. And Mr. Chen's provided basically 4 considerations for us, which is the DPI unaware mode, which is the default for VFP in most applications. And you then got system awareness, which is the fix that some people will be familiar with, where you make a registry setting to stop VFP scaling. And there's also these other two modes. I usually go for this last one, which seems to work well for my purposes. And you can also control the execution level settings for your various programs and files, but I'm just going to go with those options. And what you'll see down the bottom here is there's quite a nice progress bar showing you what's happening. And as you can see, it's installing into the installing my new VFP runtimes into the standard position. It's installing into the folder I chose, which is here under Visual FoxPro Advanced under the program files. Bit of registration going on. And I've now installed VFPA. So it really is as simple as that. If we now go and have a look at the VFPA installation folder, I thought that was it, but I'll just go and find it in here. Okay, most people will find this fairly recognizable. This is very similar to your VFP9 installation folder. It's essentially replicated. And what's happening during installation is that the VFPA installer comes to your Visual FoxPro 9 installation folder and copies across most of these folders and functionality to be replicated in VFPA. So it really is an add-on. You can't use it without Visual FoxPro 9 installed on the same machine. And it then changes or adds its add-ons. So in this case, as you can see, VFPA is here, as is VFP9, but VFPA is Visual FoxPro Advanced execution file, which is the same as VFP9, except with the bug fixes, interoperability improvements, and enhancements. So all very straightforward. It has not interfered with or affected my VFP9 installation in any fashion, hasn't touched it, it's copied out of it into a new location. The only effect on VFP9 is that, like all VFP installers, your file associations for your DBFs, your PRGs, your other VFP9 file types are now set to VFPA. So when you double click, say, browser.dbf, that will open in VFPA rather than VFP9, which is the standard VFP installer behavior. And if it's not what you want, you can run VFPA again with the reg server switch. Thanks to Rick for that. Or you can reinstall VFP9, but it's easier just to run it again with the dash reg server switch, and that will reassociate the file types with VFP9. I don't know why you do that. Since I moved to VFP9, since I've moved to VFPA, I really go back to VFP9. There is no point. So how does it work? Well, if I just start VFPA, it is essentially identical to VFP9, except for the up here, it's got Visual FoxPro Advanced rather than VFP9. If you look under About, it calls itself Visual FoxPro Advanced version 10. And there's a few other subtle differences. If we come into here under Options and look in File Locations, since time immemorial, in my experience for 30 years, Fox has stored its resource file, foxuser.dbf, in the same folder as the installation folder, which became problematic under UAC. But now, what's happening is that these files, you can't tell because of the long file name, these now default into the app data folder where they belong, which means they're no longer installed in your VFP folder, which means they are editable, and that means you don't need to run with admin features or move your VFP out of the program files folder. There's a few other features that VFPA has done. When you first install VFP, the first time you run something like GenDBC, it actually compiles that PRG, which of course can't happen if it's installed in program files because UAC protects it. So now as part of its installation, while it's got elevated privileges, VFPA actually compiles GenDBC and a few others. And that means you can then run them without running into UAC problems. This is an ongoing process, but it's got to the point now where I routinely install VFPA into the program files folder. I have no trouble. So that's all good news. All right, so that's how you install it. Now it's worth talking about why you'd want to do this. So if I come back to my slides, first of all, bug fixes. When VFP9 support ended, a number of bugs had been spotted by users. Some of them had been repaired in Service Pack 2, but actually Service Pack 2 also introduced some new bugs, and some were not fixed. There were some quite famous reporting bugs and so forth. So VFPA sets about to remedy the bugs. And this little screenshot I've had here from when I wrote the white paper had the fixes up to fix 124. If we have a look today, hope you can read this, but we're up to 130. So over the space of a few weeks, Mr. Chen has continued to fix bugs and improve the product. What I did in the white paper is I went to fix number 1 and then the last fix and looked at them. But what I'll do in a slightly more free-ranging function now is I'll start with number 1 because so many of you will recognize it. And then I'll move on to some of the other ones that I find interesting as reasons for using VFPA rather than VFP9. And this is one many of you will recognize, the notorious report footer problem. So this is Mr. Chen's example where he's produced a report which has got these squares. When it runs in VFP8 or not using the VFP9 report mode, you see what you'd expect to see, but then when you run it in VFP9, there's big gaps appearing in above the footer. And Mr. Chen describes what the bug is, which is that the page footer is added to the top non-printable area. And then for those who are interested, he's actually put the bug fix that he's utilized to remedy this fault. So when you use VFPA, you don't see that big gap. Nice. That's not the only reporting element that has been fixed. If you come down here to fix number 40, this is another artifact associated with screen scaling, in that with VFP9, if the screen scaling is more than 100%, you start to see distortions in the reports in preview. So again, this is an example to demonstrate it. As you can see, that's what you'd expect to see with the report design. And what's happening though is that when you've got screen scaling on, you've actually lost one of these because all of these have expanded out into visual artifacts and the reporting objects are too large. So once again, Mr. Chen has found the bug and he's gone in and he's fixed it. And for those who are interested, he's actually provided this source code that he's used. So when you use VFPA, you're not going to get customers ringing up saying, hey, this report that's worked beautifully using Foxy Previewer for years is now suddenly thoroughly distorted. What's going on? Doesn't happen anymore. Other interesting bugs. There's one that I experienced a lot, or a variant of it. A combo box going into an infinite loop. Some here will recognize the situation in VFP9 where if you're busy programming away and you try and use the search dialog and use the drop down in the search dialog, VFP9 freezes completely and you lose 2 hours work. And many of us unconsciously or subconsciously adopted mechanisms to try and limit that happening, but it still happened. It doesn't anymore. I'm sure it's a variant of this one, which is a combo box causing an infinite loop. Mr. Chen's found the bug and he's fixed it. Thank you. Other good reasons why you'd want to consider VFPA, if we look at number 70, increasingly as Microsoft is putting in various kinds of buffering, and also with Defender and other virus products determined to snoop what's going on. Sometimes you can perform a function like delete file and it doesn't work, and moments later it does work, which is incredibly annoying. And so what Mr. Chen has done is that he has acknowledged that this is a problem in some of these newer operating systems from Windows Defender or whatever it might be. So now, if the delete file function fails the first time, it will call it again as many times as you've defaulted it to, which I think the default is 3 for delete files. And that means that neither you nor your users are going to run into the annoyance of weird bugs like that. Okay. Another fairly high-profile bug in VFP9 involves var binary data, and I'm sure many of you will recognize this one. I've actually prepared an example that I can show you. Now, I'm actually in the X64-bit version of VFPA Advanced, which is something that I neglected to mention. When you go and download VFPA, there's a VFPA standard and there's a VFPA X64. And the X64 option truly is an X64 or 64-bit version of VFPA. The function's exactly the same, except for some X64 characteristics we'll move on to. But it allows a path forward by allowing you to offer your customers an X64 version, as opposed to being stuck in the 32-bit world. And I thought I'd actually use the X64-bit version now. So if we come into here and look at the varchar max2 project that I've prepared, I'm just going to create a new remote view, just for convenience. And I've prepared in advance a table with a varchar max field. And okay, so what I've done very quickly there is I've created a remote view. If we look at the SQL for my remote view, it's select test2.star from test2. And this field here, test1, is a varchar max field. And what I'd like to point you to is that this is correctly mapped as a memo field in VFPA X64, so that if I run this query, it's pulled back the varchar max field as you'd expect, and it is populated with some test data. If we now try that in VFP9, what we'll find is that that's not going to work quite so well. So I'll open the varchar max field, which is identical, but we can't have them both open at once. So we go into data, go into databases. Oh, that's helpful. What I've managed to do is, by opening this same database in VFPA, I've allowed it to be compiled into the VFPA version. So what I'll do instead is, if I go, I'll just run this manually. Just make sure that's worked. Okay, so I've connected. So this time, when we've pulled the data back, you can see that test 2 matches VFPA, but in VFPA, where test 1 is clearly a memo field, in VFP9, it's what exactly? I'll tell you what it is. It's a field type character of 0 length, which should be impossible in VFP. And your problem is that when you're using SQL exec, you've got no control over the returned field type. And there's actually, the only way around that is to do a cast in your SQL select. If I create a new database just for completeness and repeat what I did before, so I'm now repeating in VFP9 the creation of the remote view that I did in VFP. If we look here at the SQL, the difference that you'll see is that rather than the M, which is correctly returned by VFPA, VFP9 has defaulted this to a field type C0, which is unusable. Now, you can overcome this in VFP9 using both a remote view or a data adapter by editing this SQL here in the remote view, or by using a schema in your data adapter. But if you look at the SQL exec, you've got no control over it, and the only way to fix it is using cast. This very annoying bug is remedied in VFPA, clearly. And the reason it matters is because Microsoft has been suggesting for a very long time that the text field type, which is the SQL Server analog for VFP's memo field type, should no longer be used, and it should be replaced by varchar max. And I don't know how long cast into text type would work, even if you could use it. But this removes the problem. Now, another workaround to prevent it happening is you can use a very old SQL Server field ODBC driver, the very first SQL Server driver, which dates back to 2005. And that fortuitously will map the varchar max field as a memo in VFP, but it can't handle some of the new date types and other new advantageous SQL Server field types. And there's no saying how long Microsoft's going to include it by default with Windows. So with VFPA, you can confidently tell your customers to use the latest SQL Server ODBC driver, and it will correctly map varchar max and other field types. It also maps varchar var binary and XML field types, which are also broken using VFP9. So that's quite an important bug fix, and for some people, that's justification all by itself for using VFPA. But wait, there's more. If we look at math in VFP, I've got some examples here. Sorry, people, bear with me. Okay, there we go. Oh. We have a slight issue in on this test machine I'm using, where sometimes the mouse insists on going and staying over on the right-hand panel, but it's come back. Okay, so if we look here, close all this. Let's talk a little bit about floating point math in VFP. There have been various problems reported over the years. Let's just look at division. So I've performed the string division, looking at lots of decimal places accuracy. And as you can see, when you perform this division, you've got a 4 at that point. And when you perform it again, dividing by something slightly larger, your 4 has moved across to the next position, exactly as you'd expect. This is in VFPA. If we now try the same thing in VFP 9, didn't copy, try again. Copy. So we get what we'd expect. We then add the 0 in there, same as in VFPA, and look, it's wrong. And this is Mr. Chien's fix 124, I believe, using his exact example. And he's found the issue and he's resolved the bug so that when you perform divisions now, you can get accuracy up to 15 decimal places, which is very nice. And of course, that's not the only rounding or floating point math bug that's been fixed. If you look at fix number 24 up here, you've got another problem showing in VFP 9. When you perform this rounding function, you get a mistake. You get 9.2 at the end rather than 9.3, and the cause is here. And Mr. Chien has now fixed that. And there's actually at least one other floating point bug that's been fixed in all of these lists. There's another one that I won't show you because it's so destructive. But if you use hexadecimal values when you've got set torque off and some of the settings in VFP 9, you actually get a severe crash that requires a hard restart. This is covered in detail in my white paper. If you want to do it yourselves, feel free. I'm not going to because I don't want to break my VFP 9 and have to restart it. It's worth stepping through and looking at all of these things that he's fixed because there are so many of them. And I think, basically, even if you've never encountered any of these problems, as I most certainly have, but even if you haven't, as Benjamin Franklin said, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Why wouldn't you move across to VFPA and let your good fortune continue? I would also say that the first time one of your customers purchases a 4K 15-inch notebook, which ships by default with screen scaling turned on to 150 or 200%, and then calls you because the reporting functions don't work properly anymore, you'll wish that you'd moved. All right, so obviously we haven't got time to go through all of this. There's lots of them. What I wouldn't mind doing is dwelling a little bit on fix 80, which is something that I'd wanted for a very long time since the VFP3 beta days, which had been said to be impossible. And it's to do with temp files. Now, in VFP9, most of the control we have over temp file locations comes from the config.fpw file, where you can put your temp files, equals, and other settings. And this is covered in the white paper. And if you don't specify them, then it defaults to your Windows environment temp or TMP environment variable, which is the standard temp folder for your user profile in Windows, which has actually worked quite well for a large number of years. But there's problems occurring now. And the main problem I've encountered is that increasingly you've got security experts insisting that the temp file has to be scanned because it's, virus scanned, because it's often used by exploits or hackers as a way to get into your system. So the recommendation was that you start scanning the temp folder again. Now, we know what happens when you're virus scanning the DBFs and your Visual FoxPro temp files. The problem is that VFP calls its temp files TMP, and it's very difficult to distinguish those from other forms of TMP because they're so common. So really what you'd want to do with your customers is you want to move your application temp folders out of the temp location and put them somewhere else, so that you can tell your customer, just don't scan that folder. It's only used by our application. Hackers can't get into it. When they download something from email or from the internet, it's not going into that location, so there's no need to scan it. And the traditional way of doing that was to ship a config.fpw with your application with the temp files equals setting in it. What then happened is I know somebody who failed the security audit because the command equals command in config is also a hack vector that can be used to abuse and hack into things like database credentials and so forth. So Mr. Chen and VFPA to the rescue. What he's done, although you can't see it here, is that in the temp file, you can now put some placeholders. It's probably easiest if I go into the white paper where I've laid it out in some detail and show you. You can now go into your temp file, into your config FPW, and you can actually specify placeholders which expand. Sorry, bear with me for a moment, I'll just find it. Drum roll, drum roll. Goodness me, I don't even know my own white paper. Okay, if I can't find this quickly, I'll go into VFP and show it to you, but I'd rather just use this because it's so much easier. Okay, I can't do it. So what I'll do is if I come back into here, if you look at this previous fix 79, that's actually covering what I was just telling you. And what you can do is you can put into your temp file setting in config.fpw, you can now put placeholders. And one of the most useful ones is VFP process ID, which is the unique Windows process ID for the running VFP instance, and that will move your temp files into that particular location. As you can see, you've also got %temp there, and you've got your GUID as well, which is a random GUID, or you can use a timestamp or a prop name, which I don't think is useful. I think this one here is the most useful. So that allows you in a config.fpw, which is embedded inside your application, you can start to have control over where your temp files are put. But as you can see in this example here, you're still putting them into the temp folder. If you want to get them out of the temp folder, incredibly, you now can. You can actually pull your temp files out and control them at runtime. So it's using the sys9021 function, which is a new VFPA function. And basically, whenever you see a 9000 series sys function, you know that it's a VFPA enhancement or setting because VFP9 hasn't got any in that range. So the sys9021 allows you at runtime to specify where your temp files are going to go. And you can use those placeholders that I showed you before. So that means you can now have say a config ini file setting where you can allow your customers to control where their temp files are going to go, and at runtime, you can actually set them. The only thing to worry about is do it as early as you can in your application, because you don't want to be messing with that after there's already temp files. I'm not sure what would happen. I'd rather not find out. So you really want this to be set before temp files have been created. And the other point is you can also, if you're using your the unique prog ID or the unique proc ID for your VFP running instance, you can do things like if you're running a West Wind server with multiple instances, you can also put their temp files into separate places so that you've got completely sandboxed separate temp files for each running instance completely under your control. It's a tremendously powerful feature, and one that I'd recommend people look at. But look, I'm using a lot more time than I anticipated I would, and I haven't even got onto VFP C++ yet. So what I'll do is I'll talk now about installing C++ compiler, which installs in exactly the same way, and you can put it into the program files folder as you did before, and in the same way as it does for 64-bit and 32-bit on VFPA, you can have a separate 64-bit version, which is this one, and a separate 32-bit version, which is this one. And when it installs, as it shows you in my white paper, you have to have VFP9 there, and you also need to have a version of VC++, Microsoft Visual C++, because it makes a lot of use of both of those and copies files into the installation folder. So in this case, I've been experimenting, and these Fox run files here are versions of VC++. And as you can see, using VFP compiler, you've got from version 6, which is very early, all the way up to version 14, which is very current. It's also got VFP 6 to VFPA and VFPA 64. These are VFP runtimes depending on what you've got installed on your machine. And the installer allows you to specify which version of VC you'd like to use and which version of VFP you'd like to use. I should quickly have a look at that. So if we come in here and look at the VC32 installer, you run VC setup. And what has to happen is it's got to be able to find a version of VFP. Unlike VFPA, which requires service pack 2 of VFP9, VFP C++ can work from VFP 6 upwards, but don't do it. You really want to be using VFP 10 or VFPA. And you need to validate that it's installed because it actually requires it. So I've managed to install it. And I've then got different versions of VC++ as well down here. And I'm just going to go for VC10. And once you've validated that you've got the required dependencies, you can then go ahead and install either the 32-bit or 64-bit version. I won't do that because it does take a long time. What it does during installation is it goes ahead and populates all of these folders by harvesting files out of your various installations. So that's installation covered very quickly. What does it actually do? Well, if we come into here, and I'm just going to open a project, because the easiest way to show you some of the stuff that it can do is by opening projects that provide functionality. So this is one of the samples that ships with VFP C Compiler. It's my encrypt test, and it's a standard VFP project. And basically, when you use VFP Compiler, and we're going to go into encryption because we're running out of time, and that's probably more interest to people. Now that VCF is a Visual FoxPro Compiler metadata file, and this looks very overwhelming at first, but if I just run you through it, what you do is you specify a project which you'd like to compile. You say where you want to put it. There needs to be a runtime associated with it, and I always use VFPA. You need to specify which version of C++ you want to use, which in this case is version 7, which is the same version as is used by VFP9. And you've then got a whole lot of options for compilation. Now, what does VC actually do? Well, if I just quickly move through here now, look, I apologize, I spent a little bit longer on some of these earlier things. I've already shown you all of this, so we'll just whip through it and get to the VC++ part. Okay, what it does is it allows you to compile the newer versions of VC++. So VC7, which is the VFP9 default, dates back to 2002. You can now compile in up to version 14, which is Microsoft's very latest version of VC++. It offers compression. It offers inlining of C++ or other AES functionality, which you can use for encryption, compression, or other needs. And it reduces the need for FLLs, especially for x64. And the reason that matters is that if you're developing for x64, FLLs don't work anymore, because a 64-bit product cannot use a 32-bit DLL or FLL, and of course, all the VFP ones are 32-bit. So I covered this already. Let's look at some of the functionality that you can do with VC++. So if we look at that application that I've chosen for you, which was the My Encrypt test, in this folder, you've got two foxrun.h files, which are C++ header files. If we look at them, some people will recognize that this is a library construction kit, C++ construct. And VFP compiler will include those when it compiles, so that you end up, in this case, it's already here, you've got an EXE and a DLL, and the DLL includes whatever functions have been incorporated in this C++ here, and also most of your VFP code is incorporated inside this DLL, so that the VFP EXE has now become mostly a wrapper which calls functions in the DLL. So if we actually run it, drum roll. Here we go. So what we have here is a compiled VFP application which is able to encrypt and decrypt data without using a separate FLL like, you know, the sweet potato VFP encryption.dll. The C++ that's required to perform this test is now incorporated in the DLL which you send out with your application. So you no longer need the VFP encryption.FLL. And that's nice for 32-bit, but very important for 64-bit because you can't use VFP encryption.FLL anymore. So that's an example of the kind of functionality that you can now incorporate. And if we come back and look in here, these are all the functions. So you've got compression options. So as I said earlier, when you compile your application, you end up with a VFP EXE and a C++ DLL. You can actually compress these when you build. So that will mimic other compression functions that are offered by other products in VFP C++ compiler directly. Look at this. You can also include the VFP support library, which means that not only can you distribute your application without associated FLLs, you can actually now distribute your application without the VFP support library. That also is incorporated inside the EXE and DLL, which considerably simplifies your distribution and reduces reliance on additional files. These options here are for debugging, and they're quite important because if you think about it, if you're moving all of your VFP code into a DLL, it's no longer VFP code at all, which means that line numbers and the like are no longer relevant or usable for debugging purposes. So what these do is, if you check debug mode, what normally happens in VC compiler is that it produces a whole lot of intermediate files, and then at the conclusion of building, it deletes them all. In debug mode, it keeps the files, so you can actually see what's happening along the way. You can see your C++ H files and all the other files that are created by VC compiler. Application debug mode means that every line of code is followed by a logging file which actually logs the original code that would have run in your original VFP application. So although the line numbers are no longer there, application debug mode will show you what code would have run. So it helps you find errors, and application error log file produces a detailed error log if your system crashes. And the rest of these options you can experiment with. There's lots of different ways of multitasking and increasing the utility of the system to speed it up. And you've also got the DPI awareness modes here so that your resulting application can have DPI awareness. If you remember, we talked about the fuzziness in Windows 10, not a VFPA issue directly, but it is affected by it. And wait, there's more. Don't be overwhelmed. These are all options, mostly to do with protection, and there's a good example in the white paper. But basically, these are all obfuscation options, which either expand expressions to make them incredibly complicated, or decompose, which converts relatively simple loops and other constructs into fiendishly complicated ones. If you think about it, That happens at the VFP level. It's then converted into C++. If you use this move statement in C++, it actually jumps around on the C++ statement as well. And then when you go to compile the C++, those who are familiar with C++ will know that it is able to identify repeated sequences of C++ and move those into separate subfunctions as well. You end up with a C++ DLL, which is monumentally difficult and effectively impossible to convert back to a VFP program. So it's tremendously capable protection. These things are all optional. You don't have to use them, but why wouldn't you? And then when you've got it exactly how you want it, you can save the compile options, which will produce that VCF file I showed you earlier, which you can then use as often as you need to by double-clicking it, or there are actually command line sequences that you can use as well. Right, so it's 3 minutes before the hour. What I would like to do briefly is talk to you about 64-bit development, which is one of the huge advantages of VFPA over VFP9. The first thing is, you can forget about your FLLs in the 64-bit environment. They don't work anymore. So we're in the x64. We try and use your favorite VFP encryption.FLL. Doesn't work. It's 32-bit. What else doesn't work? Well, the Microsoft Common Controls ActiveX, which many of us have used for tree views and other functionalities, is also 32-bit. That's gone as well. There is no 64-bit version of Common Controls that comes with Windows, which means you would need to find a 64-bit commercial product. And actually, Joel Leach, who may be in attendance, very helpfully pointed out to me that there is a 64-bit version of Common Controls that comes with some of the newer Office products, but I'm not able to specify that my customers use that. Many of my customers still use Windows 7. So to all intents and purposes, you've lost that ActiveX control. And to some people, that would be a bit of a showstopper. But just in the little time we've got left, if I can just show you where there's a will, there's a way. If we come down here, what I'll show you is, if I come into this folder here, I'm going to run, this is one of my own applications, so I apologize. Oh, not sure what happened there. I think I must have. So this would look fairly familiar to most of you. Let's open that up a bit. And we have a look under services. And this is running an x64 mode. So we have a tree view here. This tree view is a VFP grid. So we're not using the common controls for it, which means it can run in 32-bit or 64-bit mode. This is not common controls either. Believe it or not, that is a VFP option group. This taskbar here is a disabled text box, and this here is a grid. So this application I'm showing you can run in x64 or x86 32-bit, and we no longer need the ActiveX control. So I guess I'm not trying to show off, I'm just trying to say to you that where there's a will, there's a way. You can move away from the Microsoft ActiveX control. And as I showed you earlier, you can also move away from your 32-bit FLLs. I like this one, and you cannot use that in 64-bit, unfortunately. This is the PhD-based fuzzy searching feature, which is very old and very useful against static files, but not so useful against editable files. Okay, so hopefully I've covered off what I needed to cover off. If I come back into here, so I showed you can include .h files in your compiler folder, and then when you compile, those will be incorporated with their functionality into your VC DLL. Hash include works a little differently in VFP C Compiler. In VFP9 and VFPA, hash include is used for including definitions, and you can't include code. In VFP C Compiler, hash include can include code, which is incredibly useful because it means that code that can only work in VC Compiler can be put into a hash include, and it won't break when you try and include it in your standard VFPA or VFP9 functions. You can also include little C++ or AES snippets using hash include. So I've got a little bit over time. Summary. VFPA and VFP C Compiler are VFP9 add-ons for bug fixes, improved interoperability with Windows and other tools, and enhancements. Enhancements include things like improved temp file handling, multiple attempts at file commands which can break if you've got Windows Defender or buffering in place, and other features like that. Bug fixes, I covered a few of them off. There's a few more covered off in the white paper. You've got 32-bit and x64 development options now. x64, just be a bit careful. If you're using FLLs or common controls, you've got a problem. But as I tried to show you, where there's a will, there's a way. You can get around those. VFP C Compiler is how you get around them. And you can now start to offer compiled product that's not stuck back in the VC7 time warp. There was no 64-bit VC7, but you can now compile all the way up to VC14. And of course, Fox rocks, and so do you. Those are already there when I used this template, so I left them there. So thank you for that. As I said to you, it's an enormous topic. It's difficult to cover everything you want to cover in only an hour, but I've done my best. The white paper covers off as much as possible in a semi-organized fashion. And my advice to people is, there's no reason not to download and install VFPA. It will not interfere with your VFP9. It carries a whole lot of bug fixes. It can be distributed in the same fashion as VFP9, except obviously you've got to use the VFPA runtimes, which include the bug fixes. And those can be found in the same location as the VFP9 runtimes, which is that Microsoft shared folder. And have a good look at VFP C Compiler, which offers a path forwards tremendous IP protection, compression, and encryption, and lots of increased functionality that was said to be impossible in VFP, but is certainly possible now because you can include .h files with C++ that include the functionality. And that is the end of the presentation. It's my time, 10:35 tomorrow morning.
Which is fine, John.
Only left 10 minutes
and we do have a few. The folks in the chat have been doing a great job of answering other people's questions along the way. And what I've tried to do is just hang on to the ones that I think didn't get answered in chat. So the first one, it was pretty early in the session, asked, Does that fix the pack command with the antivirus leaving the file open?
Okay, I assume that's a reference to a problem which many of us have encountered, and actually I lost the customer because of this. The virus scanner, if it's scanning the place where VFP puts its intermediate temp files, some of which you really even see, they've got big long file names. If your virus scanner takes a grab of that and scans it when VFP believes it's got exclusive use of its own temp file, you get a bizarre error, and there's not a lot you can do about it. When this happened to me, it was happening with a web application which was absolutely hammering a SQL Server database, and all of its temp files were in the same place, and was incredibly difficult to debug. So in VFPA, what I would recommend is, if there's any risk of that, or if you've got security experts, and by the way, security in 2020 is like the Y2K bug consultants coming in. They're making a lot of money, and they specialize in advising customers on ways to improve security. It's very important in both Europe and the United States, which have both got quite strong privacy legislation, the GDPR in the case of Europe, and you've got articles like HIPAA in the United States. There's also Privacy Act elsewhere. My advice is to head it off. Benjamin Franklin's ounce of protection being worth a pound of cure. Front foot it with your customers. Tell them that they may well find themselves in a situation where they need to scan their temp folder. And here, using your brilliant application, is how they can take your temp folders and put them into a separate location, which can't be accessed by email, can't be accessed by the browser, and therefore doesn't need to be scanned. And it's not mixing files from any other application. So using that sys command that I showed you, was it 9021? You can actually specify where the temp file should go, and you do have complete control over it.
The next item, I think you sort of touched on, but the question was whether VFPA is backward compatible.
If by that people mean, can you write code in VFPA and backtrack it to use in VFP9? The answer to that, the obvious answer first, which obviously is, if you've used some of the new VFP features like sys 9021, which is that temp folder feature, that can't be backward compatible. The other issue, though, is that when you compile your PRG or your DBC, or as we saw actually when I was giving you a demonstration, when you compile that in VFPA, the compiled version is not backward compatible with VFP9, but you can recompile it in VFP9 and it then becomes compatible again. So VFPA does not alter the structure of your PRG or your project or anything else. If you do, for whatever reason, need to take it back into VFP9, you can just do a rebuild all in your project, or you can rebuild your DBC, or you can recompile your PRG and you're back in VFP9.
From Andrew, does VFPA support multi-threading?
That is a very interesting question, and it's a shame we haven't got more time, because Mr. Chen has got a version 10.1 in beta. Version 10.1 has got a number of features. The first feature is that it can use more than 2 gigabytes of memory on a 32-bit operating system, which theoretically is impossible. And the way it does that is by utilizing 2 threads. It can also use, I think it's 32 gigs of memory on a 64-bit operating system via the same means of spawning multiple processors. And of course, VFPA 64 can use all the memory on the machine, theoretically up to the terabyte range. But VFPA 32-bit can use 2 processors in order to utilize more memory. Apart from that, it's equivalent to VFP9 in the way that it uses apartment model threading.
Okay, a couple
Hopefully
more.
that answers the question.
Steve asks, are there any legal implications for using this within a production client setting, or is it purely considered an add-on?
Right. This has been discussed at length in the 10 years that I've been using VFPA, and to the point where I've taken legal advice in multiple jurisdictions. I'm not a lawyer. My advice to you would be that the presentation I've given to you today is a good blueprint for seeking legal advice if you want to. The key attributes of VFPA and VFP C Compiler are that they are VFP9 add-ons. As I showed you, you cannot utilize them without VFP9 installed on the machine, neither of them. The purpose is bug fixes, interoperability improvements, and enhancements. And I think you'll find that in most jurisdictions, bug fixes, interoperability improvements, and enhancements are common law, very well defined departures from any claims that a vendor might have over its product. So with 130 bug fixes, with clear interoperability improvements, such as the fuzzy header that I talked about, the varchar max to interface better with SQL Server, and the enhancements like the temp feature, I don't think your legal bill will be very much at all if that is the blueprint you take to seek legal advice.
And Kenneth
Hopefully that
asks,
answers your question.
is the 2 gigabyte file limit overcome with this?
Right. I mentioned earlier, the first point is that in VFPA, the answer to that is no. However, there is a VFPA 10.1 beta, which is actually available, and if only we had another hour, I would spend some time in that with you. But VFPA 10 beta overcomes the file limit. Depending whether you use the 32-bit or 64-bit version, and depending on the block size you use, but the 10.1 beta product now has a theoretical upper limit of file size into the terabyte range. When you do that, you run into certain potential problems, like the size of binary indexes if you index the result. In VFP9, if you index a DBF and there isn't enough memory left to create a binary index, you actually get an error. We don't see that because usually you're not indexing that large a file. But if you're using very large files, you start to run into problems like that. And if you have a look right down the very end here, you've got some new fixes, which is checking for file size so that rather than getting a crash, you can actually identify the problem. You can see how recent this is. So VFPA has got the same limit as VFP9. It is in fact a 32-bit file limit, but the beta product is able to use larger files as long as the operating system
And
can.
that was the last question, so thank you. I just want to remind everybody that the sessions, social spaces, and the expo will remain open for several more hours if you want to go hang out with people and chat. Thank you, John.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, and it was a pleasure and hopefully useful.